Good morning, everyone, and welcome to LIHTC Fundamentals. We're going to have a lot of fun today. There are a couple of little elements built in that we think you'll really enjoy on our presentation to shake things up. My name is Clara Parisa, and I'm with the California Housing Partnership. I am going to share my screen. Here we go. Can anyone drop in the chat? Can you all see this screen, or give me a thumbs up, maybe Lauren? Oh, perfect. Great. Awesome. So we've got a 2-hour training today. We'll take a break in the middle. Today we'll be joined by 3 different panelists. So I am an associate director of consulting supervision with in Northern California with the California Housing Partnership. My colleague Lauren Maddock will also be presenting today. She's the director of portfolio recapitalization. And then at the end of the presentation, we're very lucky to be joined by Anthony Zito, who's the deputy director of the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. In addition to the folks that you see on the screen, there's a whole host of folks behind the screens from Housing California and from the California Housing Partnership. Just to quickly introduce and thank a couple people from our team. Meg McGraw-Shear will be handling the Q&A in the Q&A box, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Sharon Bennett will be handling our poll questions. And then there are a few other folks, Manjia Belazaire and Michelle Coulter, who really helped us put the presentation together. So thank you to them. If you haven't yet, I dropped in the chat a link to download the slides for today. I'll drop it one more time. There it is. You should be able to get a PDF version of the slides. I highly recommend you download it. You can use it to take notes. You can reference later the materials that we go over today. We hope that it's a resource for you. Before we dive in, I really want to just talk very briefly about the California Housing Partnership. So the California Housing Partnership is a nonprofit organization that works across the state of California to create and preserve affordable and sustainable homes for Californians with low incomes by providing expert financial and policy solutions to nonprofit and public partners. We do both sort of financial consulting, which is the team you're going to hear from today, as well as a lot of policy work centered around finance and sustainable housing in the state of California. Oops. Sorry, one second. I'm just having trouble going to the next slide. Okay, there we go. So as I mentioned, we've got the financial consulting team, the policy team, and then we also have some really great tools, which we hope that you'll be able to use. We have housing data tools, including a list of all of the affordable housing properties in the state of California and a housing needs dashboard, which we hope that you can use in your advocacy work. So before we begin, you may be wondering, how are we going to put the fun in LIHTC Fundamentals today? So what we're going to do is this. We have a number of poll questions throughout the presentation, most of which are going to be checking your understanding. We're going to use honor system here. If you get all of them or most of them right, at the end, we'll do a standing ovation and call out your names. But again, you'll have to tell us if you got them right, because we are not tracking who got them right. So that'll be the honor system. Before we do the sort of pop quiz poll questions, we're going to start with a couple here. These are just kind of getting a temperature of who's in the room. There are 2 different questions. Sharon's already put them on the screen. So where do you work? And what's your comfort level with LIHTC? Beginner or expert? If you're in the middle, round up or round down. Okay, we'll give another couple, 5-10 seconds. Okay, Sharon, if you could close the poll, please. So I'm not sure if folks can see the results here, but it looks like we've got a pretty good mix of folks here. We've got about a quarter of the folks are developers, 23 developers in the room. A quarter also public agency folks. That's really great. We love, doing these presentations with public agency folks. A handful of folks from financial institutions and a good chunk of other. So maybe next time we do this poll, we need to parse that out a bit more. And then it looks like 90% of the folks in the room really feel that their comfort level with LIHTC is beginner, and that's fine because you're in the right place. Hopefully you'll walk away today and you'll feel more intermediate. And then when you get your hands dirty, it'll be even better. So the next thing we're hoping you can do, is drop in the chat, either in Whova or in Zoom, of the agenda items that you see today, and I'll walk through them. Kind of what items are you most excited to learn about today? We're going to cover a lot of things. But we're looking to see what you're most excited to learn about. So we're going to talk about tax credit program basics. What is LIHTC and why does it matter? What is a tax credit, right? You may have heard of this, solar tax credits or childcare tax credits. What is that and how does it function? We're going to talk about federal eligibility and affordability requirements. So that's at the federal level. What does the IRS require for you to actually be able to claim these credits? We're going to talk about how to calculate the credit, which is my favorite part. That's the math part. We're going to talk about different types of credits. You may have heard, hey, I've heard about 9% credits. I've heard about 4% credits. What's the difference? Or what are these state credits everyone's talking about? We're going to talk about that. You'll come away with a sense of that. We're going to talk about the timeline for how to get credits, how to claim credits. We're going to talk about TCAC requirements and underwriting. So what does TCAC, the state level agency, require for you to get these credits and to participate in the program? And then finally, tips on obtaining allocation. Okay, I want to use tax credits to build affordable housing. Where do I start? How do I get the tax credits, right? Okay, great. So I'm just looking here at the chat. Looks like, oh, there's all sorts of good things here. 1, 5, 7, and 8 keep coming up. Okay, tax credit basics, types of credits, obtaining allocation. Okay, federal timeline, requirements, underwriting, all 5. This is great. Okay, cool. Well, this is good. We're going to cover all of these things today, and it looks like there's definitely some emphasis on number 1. I like a couple of folks said 1 twice. That's good. We will definitely spend a good amount of time on the tax credit program basics. So just before we jump in, a couple of ground rules. I don't think we can hear anyone who's an attendee, but always good practice to mute yourself. And if you can, there's a lot to cover today, so please mute any distractions you have in your workspace. We are going to handle Q&A in the Q&A box. So there's a Q&A box on Whova, as I understand, and on Zoom. Meg from the California Housing Partnership will be answering your questions in the Q&A box. So if you have a question about something that we've covered, please type it there. Don't wait till the end. If you have sort of a juicier question, we may have time at the end for questions, TBD. But if you can put in the chat box, and Meg will go ahead and answer your technical questions there. Again, we're going to have polls. We're hoping that you all will answer and participate in the polls. If you are paying attention, you will be able to answer all the poll questions easily. Most of the poll questions we're going to ask, the answer is on the slide directly preceding the poll question. So if you're paying attention, you're going to get that standing ovation at the end. All right, let's jump straight in. Starting with the basics. So what is the low-income housing tax credit program? So it was started as part of the Tax Reform Act of 1986. 1 second, I'm just going to move this. Okay. Tax Reform Act of 1986. And that act included the provisions to begin the low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC, right? If you've heard of this, of people saying LIHTC, that's what it is. Again, it's the low-income housing tax credit. The idea here is that it's a program that would sort of serve as the fundamental way to build affordable housing in the United States. So LIHTC is a nationwide, oh, it looks like people cannot see the slides. I'm sorry. I apologize. It may be that it only shows up on, I have two screens. It may be that it's only showing up on this one screen. Okay, I will just keep the slides there. Okay, so that's how the program started. That's what the low-income housing tax. Thank you, Rachel, and all that you can see it now. That's good. Apologies. Now what happens every year is that the IRS apportions 9% low-income housing tax credits to state allocating agencies, and the state allocating agency then decides who gets the tax credits according to the sort of methodology, public benefit scoring system that they come up with. So in 2021, there was $2.81 per person across the country was allocated in state credits, and then that's multiplied by the number of people. So in states like California, we get more because we have a higher population, right? Since the 1986 Tax Reform Act, there have been a number of different bills and acts at the federal level that have altered the tax credit program. So for example, here, 2018, omnibus spending bill increased the 9% credits by 12.5% through 2021, right? So occasionally there are bills that temporarily increase or change the program at the federal level. So after the state tax credits are allocated, or sorry, after the credits are, sort of decided how much each state's going to get, each state agency gets to determine how the state credits are going to be allocated to different projects through what's called a qualified allocation plan, or QAP. Now, for those of you working in other states, you may have heard the QAP called the QAP in your state, right? So when I first learned about the tax credit program in grad school, I was in Boston. And so we used to talk about the Massachusetts QAP. When I came to California, I said to myself, where's the California QAP, right? Because we don't call it that, it's the regulations. I don't know if that's a light bulb moment for anybody, but if you worked in another state and you're used to us talking about the QAP in California, we call the TCAC regulations, okay? So the QAP, in this case, the TCAC regulations, are guidelines for allocating the credit to projects in the state of California, right? Because there aren't enough generally credits to go around for everyone. So how does the state decide who gets the tax credits? And the QAP, or again, in the state of California, the regulations, it's a vehicle for state policy objectives. So we align who gets the credits with what type of housing we want to see built, right? So again, TCAC, the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, Anthony Zito later will be, he's just joined us. Hi, Anthony. He'll be presenting later at the second half of the presentation. They're California's allocating agency. So they make the decisions around how to allocate the tax credits. So developers will apply a few times a year. There are open rounds. So developers apply for a tax credit allocation, and then TCAC will review the application. If it's competitive, it meets all the threshold requirements, then they'll allocate tax credits to that project. TCAC also monitors compliance for tax credit projects after the development has completed construction and is in operations. Okay, great. So what happens once you've won an allocation of credits, right? So Anthony's group says, okay, we love your project. You're competitive, you've gotten all the points, you've done well on the tiebreaker, you've met all of our threshold requirements, you have an allocation of credits. So how do we turn this allocation of tax credits into money that we can use to build affordable housing or rehab affordable housing or acquire housing to rehab. So what happens is that you take these tax credits and you market them or you sell them to investors, right? And it's kind of a strange concept, but you can think of it this way. In California, we work exclusively with nonprofit affordable housing developers. A tax credit, as we'll talk about later, will sort of offset your tax liability. So the amount of tax that you pay to the federal government. You have a tax credit, it's like a gift certificate. You don't have to pay that tax, right? We'll talk about that more. As a nonprofit, you don't pay taxes. So you can't use those tax credits on your own, right? And so what we do is we take that almost like a gift certificate and we say, hey, who wants this, right? Who has liability to pay taxes, income taxes, or corporate income taxes? And a bunch of investors say, hey, I have tax liability. I'd like to buy your tax credits. So that's what we say. We market or we sell or we syndicate, you may have heard that term, tax credits to investors. And the investors are often folks like banks. There are people who are called syndicators that buy the tax credits and then sell them on, right? Sort of like a middle person. Your tax credits are delivered over 10 years. So you get the same amount of tax credits every year. So as you can see in this diagram, there are 10 years of tax credits. So you get, from the state of California, you get an allocation, let's say it's $1 million of tax credits annually. Those credits are delivered every single year. You get $1 million, right? So your investor, in this case, who buys the tax credit, is going to get $1 million of tax credits to offset their tax liability. And they're going to pay for that. They're going to pay you money, right? Because you're provide money that they pay you for the tax credits and use that as equity to build or rehab your property. Okay, great. I know that's kind of a weird concept, so you may need to hear it a couple of different times before it kind of settles in, but that concept, getting the tax credit allocation, selling it to an investor, is central, is very core to the way that we do affordable housing in the United States. So again, the low-income housing tax credit is a tax incentive. It's an offset that's a credit against taxes due from the government. So if you have a tax credit, $1 tax credit, that means you don't have to pay $1 of taxes, right? Okay. You have to meet federal eligibility guidelines and requirements in order to get the tax credits. It's not like, you or I, as individuals can, go to Anthony and say, hey, Anthony, can I have some tax credits? Right? No, Anthony and the federal government say you have to meet certain requirements in order to get tax credits. And we'll go through what those are. In the 9% program, the competition for tax credits is fierce, right? Remember we said there's only $2.81 per person. That's not enough tax credits for all the developers that want them. So there's actually a competitive process to obtain tax credits. Okay. So, let me just go back one before we go into this question. So when you sell your tax credits, you actually admit the investor as a limited partner into the property. So the limited partner is the investor. They come into the partnership with the developer. So they become a limited partnership with the developer and the investor become a limited partnership. The investor is the one who receives the tax credits, okay? The developer doesn't receive any tax credits. After they sell them, the limited partner gets all the tax credits, all the tax benefits is what we call it. So, oops, sorry, okay, so poll question number 2, really quick. Which partner receives the tax benefits? We'll give about 10 seconds for this one. So we talked about the developer, we talked about the general partner, we talked about the limited partner, the investor is the limited partner. So who receives the tax benefits? 5 more seconds. Okay, if we can close the poll, please. Hey, nice work. 85% of you got it. Limited partner. Nice work, everyone. You're on your way to your standing ovation, right? So the tax benefits go, the tax credits, right? They go to the limited partner. The limited partner is the investor. They're the folks who buy the credits. Okay, great. I'm repeating things because there's some core lessons that you should learn. Okay, so the amount of credit varies by project that you're allocated. The amount of tax credit sort of varies depending on construction and construction related costs, the percent of units in your development that are affordable, right? Because you may have some market rate units. You're not going to get tax credits for market rate units. And then the percent of the project used for affordable housing. So the equity that you get from selling these tax credits can provide up to 70% in some cases of your total development costs, right? So if that's 70%, then you'll have loans from your local agency, from the state of California. You may even have a mortgage to cover the last 30%. Then you have all the money you need to build affordable housing. So again, you know, there's this idea that the investor will receive tax credits over 10 years from the partnership. In the state of California, there are limited partnerships that are formed between the limited partner, again, that's the investor, and what we call the general partner. The general partner is an entity controlled by the developer. Those two partners together make the limited partnership that owns the property, but all the tax benefits flow to the limited partner. Tax credits are given over the course of 10 years. So again, each year there's the same annual credit given to the property that the investor gets to take. The investor usually stays with the property, stays in this limited partnership that owns the project for 15 years. So that's the compliance period. So the ownership compliance period is a 15-year term, and the credits are delivered at 10 years. During that 15-year compliance period, that's when you have to continue delivering on the promises that you made in order to get those tax credits. And we'll talk more about what those are later. If you fail to deliver on the promises and meet the requirements that you made in order to get those tax credits, your tax credits can be called what we call recaptured, meaning they can be taken back. You don't get those tax credits anymore. And that can happen anytime in the first 15 years of the property in operations. And so that's why the investor, the limited partner stays in the deal. They want to stay in the deal for 15 years in order to make sure that the property's tax credits aren't going to be recaptured. If they lose their tax credits, then they owe the IRS a lot of money. So they stay in for 15 years. That's the compliance period. That's the ownership period. But the credits are delivered over 10 years. Okay. There are two types of tax credits. You may have heard people talking about this, the 9% tax credit, the 4% tax credit. The 9% tax credit is competitive. That's the one that's limited. The 4% tax credit sort of by right, that's unlimited. There's anyone who wants 9 or 4% tax credits that can meet the requirements can technically receive tax credits. They have to be coupled with tax exempt bonds. If you're attending that session later today, you'll learn more about that. The bond program is competitive. So if you can't get bonds, you can't get 4% credits. So in a way, the 4% credit program is competitive, but only because the bonds are competitive. The 4% credits themselves are not competitive. So 9% credits are allocated to the state by the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, and then tax exempt bonds, which you'll learn about later today if you attend that session, are allocated by the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee. And those two committees work in concert. Okay, great. I'm going to go into what is a tax credit next. We're a little bit behind here. So as we said before, a tax credit is a dollar for dollar reduction of taxes owed, right? So if you have a child, you may have heard of the child care tax credit, right? This is I think it's a few $1,000s. I don't have a kid, but I think it's a few $1,000s every year that you actually don't have to pay in taxes on your income because you have a child. You may have heard of solar tax credits, right? If you put solar on your property, you don't have, there's actually a credit to help you incentivize putting it on your property. Tax credits are often given when the federal government wants to incentivize certain activities, right? Because it's a dollar, there's a real value there to an individual. So this can push people over from one behavior to another. So from not having solar on your property to having solar on your property, or incentivizing the development of affordable housing This is a tax credit is different from a tax deduction. A tax credit is all about reducing dollar for dollar your tax liability, right? The amount of money you owe to the government. A tax deduction, on the other hand, reduces your income in order, and then you pay less in taxes on that reduced income, right? So on the personal level, you may be familiar with this. If you, when you donate to a charity, people talk about it being tax deductible, right? So if let's say you earn $50,000 a year and you make a $2,000 contribution to a local nonprofit, you're not going to be taxed on $50,000 of income. You're going to be taxed on $48,000 of income, right? $2,000 less because you made that donation. That's a tax deduction. A tax credit is an actual, like as we said, a sort of a certificate that writes down your actual tax liability. In a affordable housing development, there are tax credits and there are tax losses. This is sort of a more advanced topic, but there are additional benefits to the investor beyond just the tax credits. Again, this sort of explains the difference between a tax credit and a tax deduction. If you have the slides, this is a good thing to study later, right? This talks about sort of when you don't have any tax incentives, you're not super happy. If you have a tax deduction, that's great. But the real value here is the tax credit. The happiest you can get is writing off your taxes. So the tax credit is the takeaway here is a tax credit is much more valuable than a tax deduction. And this is a good way for visual learners to study this later. So I think we have our next poll question. What is more valuable to the taxpayer, $100 in tax credits or $100 in tax deductions? We'll give about 5 seconds here. Okay, can we close the poll, please? And nice work, 87%. Yes, $100 in tax credits is more valuable than $100 in tax deductions, because $100 in tax credits means you don't have to pay $100 in taxes. $100 in tax deductions just reduces your taxable income, right? And again, study that last slide offline to learn more about that. Just a reminder for folks who are putting questions in the chat, if you put one there, no worries, Meg's going to answer, but please do, if you can, put them in the Q&A box instead. That way it's just a little bit easier to manage all the questions, okay? Great. Yes. Now I'm going to pass it off to Lauren, who's going to talk a little bit about federal eligibility and affordability requirements. Thanks, Lauren.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire. That was an awesome introduction to the tax credit program. So we're going to talk about eligibility to access the federal tax credit program. And what I want people to keep in mind, sort of a visual representation, the federal guidelines are what I think of as the base layer of a layer cake. So all projects across the country that access tax credits are all going to be required to adhere to the federal IRS, and we always reference it as the Section 42 of the federal IRS code. Everyone is subject to those guidelines. And then, as Claire explained, the tax credits are then allocated to the states. And here in the state of California, TCAC, I consider that the second layer on my layer cake. They have their own guidelines and requirements. And then TCAC also has requirements for different housing types. And we are going to discuss the different tax credit programs later in our program. But I just want to keep that visual of the layer cake in your brain while we go through the different eligibility requirements. So on that federal base layer, the IRS mandates that the housing cannot be transient rental housing, which includes single room occupancy projects that are used for short-term rentals. And the federal guidelines dictate that a short-term rental is something that is less than 6 months. So that would include hotels, motels, those sorts of things. The federal government also mandates that residents' income must be less than 60% of the published area median income. In some cases, your project might access the income averaging requirement, which would allow you to go up to 80% of the published area median income. The project can be new construction. It could also be a substantial rehabilitation, or it can be an acquisition of an existing building with a rehabilitation component to it. So next slide. So the ineligible projects, I mentioned that the single room occupancy, hotel style buildings, those are not eligible for tax credits. Owner occupied buildings are also not eligible. This doesn't mean that an apartment building with a manager unit is not eligible. I'm talking about single family home structures. Employment provided housing. So that would be housing that might be provided to firefighters. They might be provided to the military, or it might be to other trades that provide housing. Also, nursing homes are not eligible. Same goes for retirement homes, life care facilities, hospitals, any type of dormitory, and then finally mobile home parks. That doesn't mean that manufactured housing is not accessible. It's just the mobile home parks are not able to access tax credits. So let's go to the next slide. So the federal level, again, this is the base layer of that layer cake. There are federal guidelines for affordability. And this means that anybody who wants to live in your project must meet the federal minimum guidelines. So you as a developer would have an option to select. The first would be 20% of your units would be at 50% of the area median income. The next option you could select is 40% of your total units in your project are at 60% of the area median income. And then finally, there is a third option for projects to select 40% of their units at an average of 60% area median income. If you access this, you can go up to the 80% AMI. However, the average must still remain 60%. We always encourage our development partners to select the 40% at 60% AMI for the 4% bond program. That is because when you select the 20 at 50, there is a nuance to that bond program. That means that you must actually have all of your units, if your project is 100% affordable, at 50% AMI. And you would select this for both your tax credit and your bond application. We don't recommend this, as it does mean for the bond aspect of your project, you are not allowed to charge any rents in excess of 50% AMI. So we always recommend, for flexibility for your application, you select the 40% of units at 60% AMI. So, quiz time. For those of you paying attention, what am I recommending for 4% projects to select as your set aside? All right, we'll give it a minute and let's see what those results are. Nice, you guys did awesome. All right, we've got a 90% correct rate, 40% at 60. I can't stress this enough. If you are applying for bonds and tax credits, you want the most flexibility possible. And so select 40% at 60% AMI. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we get into those layer cake layers. Here we go. The federal base layer of your layer cake requires that there be an initial 15-year compliance period. That is the period of time that the tax credits are going to be monitored by your state agency, and there is a potential for a recapture of tax credits if that agency discovers that you have leased a unit to an ineligible person. There is also a federal 30-year extended compliance period to ensure that the project continues to remain affordable to those that are renting for the full 30-year term. The investor typically exits the partnership after the 15-year initial compliance period, and the general partner, which is typically the development company, will continue to manage and operate that project for 30 years. Now, the second layer of our layer cake is the state of California. They have a 55-year total extended compliance period. So these projects are mandated to remain affordable at those AMI levels that we just reviewed for 55 years. Thus ensuring that the affordability of the project is accessible to the residents of the state of California for an extended period of time. Okay, gross rent limitation. This is a concept that even I myself, when I first started working in the tax credit program, I had a hard time wrapping my head around this. So again, every year the state publishes the average area median income. From there, they designate units at different income levels. Residents must pay 30% of the published income level. And I know what trips people up sometimes is they interpret this to mean 30% of a resident income, which is not the case. So every year those income levels get published, and then TCAC mandates that you charge no more than 30% of the published income level. This is based on the bedroom sizes, which is then tied to the anticipated number of persons that would be living in the household. So again, TCAC publishes these rents annually. They also recognize the fact that tenants in most apartment buildings are going to be responsible for paying for utilities. In that case, any utility that a resident is responsible for paying, there is issued typically by your local housing authority, a utility allowance for each of those utilities. So for example, if a tenant is paying for heat and they're paying for their general electricity, there will be an allowance based on the bedroom size published by the housing authority. You, as the operator of the apartment building, would then deduct that allowance from the published TCAC rent, and then that would be the net rent that you charge your residents of your building. There is an alternate method that some developers choose to access, which is the California Utility Allowance Calculator. This is a very specific calculation based on your building, which is derived from energy efficient systems in your building. Now, developers may choose to utilize this QAC, the California Utility Allowance Calculator, either at application, or if they have not completed their building specific assessment, they can access the QAC up until the point that they place their building in service and file the application with TCAC after the construction has been completed. Next slide. So that was our overview. And we are going to move on to our next section, which is very exciting. We get into the math of calculating the actual credits that your building is going to be eligible for.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So we're about to throw some heavy math at you. It's not that heavy, right? It's multiplication largely. That's all we're going to be doing. We're going to basically just be multiplying numbers. But the first time that you hear about how to calculate the tax credit, it can be a little bit daunting. So what I am hoping that you guys take away from this is that there is a calculation that is required as as part of the federal tax credit program, and that it all starts with your actual costs to develop or rehab a property, and you do a number of steps, and then you end up with a dollar figure of actual money that you're going to get to build your affordable housing or to rehab your affordable housing. Please take home these slides that we've shared with you in the chat and use them to review the calculation at home, because you're not going to learn, if this is new to you, you're not going to learn it today, and that's fine, because we don't expect, no one is going to expect you to walk away from this presentation being like, I got it, I can do it right now, I don't need any reference guides, I can calculate the tax credit. So just be patient with yourself as you learn this stuff. And we'll walk through it, but again, take the slides home and practice. Where do we start? So the first place that we start is with your development budget, right? So your architecture costs, your construction costs, your insurance costs, everything in your development budget that you need to spend in order to, again, develop or rehab a building. Some of these costs are what we call eligible basis. These are costs that are associated with the actual construction of a building. There are a few rules about what's included in eligible basis and when it's not included in eligible basis. Eligible basis is sort of the what you actually get to claim in calculating the tax credits, right? So not every expense is basis eligible, is what we call it. So costs that do get to be factored into that equation include hard costs like your construction costs, architecture, engineering, again, everything that you need to actually construct the project. What's not included are things like land, right? You don't actually, yes, you need to build the building on the land, but if the building were to burn down tomorrow, the land would still be there. So that doesn't get included. You also cannot include anything that is associated with the operations of the property. So as soon as you're done with construction, any cost that you incur, leasing up the property, funding operating reserves, that type of thing, that does not get included in eligible basis. So there are many different tricks and tips to remember what's included and not included in eligible basis. What I like to think of is what I alluded to earlier. If the building were unfortunately to burn down, what would it cost to rebuild? What expenses would you need to incur to rebuild? So you'd have to pay an architect, you'd have to pay an engineer, you'd have to pay for the construction costs, you'd have to pay for the developer fee, permits, whatever. All of those costs are basis eligible, construction loan interest for the most part. But we don't have to pay for the land again, so that doesn't get included. And since it burned down, we're not concerned with what happens after we reconstruct it, right? That also, anything, any operation expenses, that does not get included in eligible basis. So again, people come up with different types of tricks and tips in order to remember what's in and out of eligible basis. You should talk to your financial consultants, like the California Housing Partnership, to discuss what's included in basis. Your accountant can also tell you, your attorney also will make these determinations. There's some that are sort of gray area. So here's an example. Let's pretend this is our sample development budget. So there's the land costs, the hard construction costs, the soft costs, syndication costs. Syndication costs are costs associated with marketing and selling the tax credit, right? That's what syndication is, and reserves. So our total development budget in this example is $6.4 million. Of the $6.4 million, only some of it gets counted as eligible basis. Remember, we said land does not count. In this case, syndication costs also do not count. The funding of operating reserves also does not count. So of our $6.4 million budget, $5 million is included in eligible basis. And I'm just looking here. I see some chat. Oh, it looks like some people are having trouble accessing the slides. I'm hoping the Housing California team might be able to jump in here and help share them. I'm not sure if there's another way that works better than the Google link that I shared. I apologize. But hopefully folks are going to be able to get the slide deck. Okay, so let's start with this concept. We've got $5 million in eligible basis. These are the costs that are going to go into the math equation to calculate our tax credit, okay? Right, that's that $5 million eligible basis. Okay, so here is the full equation, right? We're going to go through this part by part, but we start with the eligible basis at the top, right? So we've taken our development budget, determined what's an eligible basis. Next, we're going to move on to the high cost area adjustment. So this is a really great element of the tax credit calculation. If you're in what we call a QCT, qualified census tract, or in a difficult to develop area, right? If the project is located in one of those areas, you actually get to take this 130% boost on the eligible basis, which is fabulous, right? That means you get more eligible basis, like we want the tax credit to be large, right? The more tax credits we have, the more we can sell to that investor, the more money they're going to pay us, the more money we have to build the development. So many developments actually plan, hey, should we buy this site? Or I don't know, is it in a QCT or a DDA? If it is, that can be a reason to purchase the property, right? Because we know then that we're going to get this extra boost that helps make the property more feasible. Okay, so we have to make that determination. There's a website. You can actually Google QCT DDA map. It'll take you to this website, and you put in the property address, and it'll tell you, are you in or are you out? So here's a map, for example, of the Bay Area, of LA, San Diego, all of the census tracts and areas that are colored in either kind of that rusty red color or the purple color, they get this boost. So you can see it's actually quite common to be in a QCT or DDA. Every year, the QCTs and DDAs shift a little bit. So you have to kind of pay attention to this because you could be in one year and out of one next year, and that can have really big impact on your feasibility. So let's pretend for our calculation that we're working on that we're in a QCT, right? So we've got our eligible basis. Remember that's a $5 million number. We're going to multiply that by 130%. So look, our adjusted eligible basis is now $6.5 million. Great. We want that number to be as high as possible. Next, we're going to talk about the applicable fraction. So this is what percent of the units in your development are going to be affordable, right? Because you could have a mixed use or sort of a mixed income development. You could have a property where half of the units are affordable and half of the units are market rate. You're only going to get tax credits on the units that are affordable. So Lauren kind of touched on this. You do not get tax credits for market rate units, right? There's no incentive needed to build market rate units because you're going to charge market rents for those. The incentive is only for the affordable housing units, okay? So the applicable fraction is what percentage of the property is going to be for affordable housing. So I am not going to go through this slide in depth. This is one of those slides that I want you to use as reference later. It talks about how do you determine what the applicable fraction is. You can do it on a square footage basis, right? What of all of the square footage in the property, what percent is affordable versus market, or you can do it based on the straight up just count of units. What number of units is affordable versus not? Okay, and you take the lesser of the two. Again, I'm not going to go over this in depth. Please reference this later offline. Okay. And that gets us what we call qualified basis, right? So it's the portion of the building's eligible basis attributable to low income tenants. Again, this is another little example here, another visual. In this case, if the green houses are affordable and the black house is a market rate, then that's sort of, then you have 75, you can count 75% of this eligible basis as your qualified basis. In our example, we're going to pretend that this is a 100% affordable property, which is what most nonprofit developers, many of the folks on this call, are going to be developing. So often that percentage is 100%, right? So in this case, we take the adjusted eligible basis, we multiply it by 100% because 100% of our units are affordable, and then we get our qualified basis. Next, we're going to multiply it by the tax credit rate. Now, when we talk about 9% credits and 4% credits, this is one of the big places where that difference comes into play. You are going to use a tax credit rate of 9% or a tax credit rate of 4%, depending on which program you are in. As you can imagine, remember we talked about we want these numbers to be as high as possible so that at the end, we end up with a lot of tax credits. You can imagine that multiplying a number times 9% is going to give you a higher result than multiplying a number by 4%. That's why the 9% credit is more valuable. You get more tax credits, okay? So in this next step, you multiply by either 9% or 4%. It used to be that both of these rates changed every month. It was like roughly 4%, but it really could range anywhere from like 3% to 4% for the 4% rate. And then for the 9% rate used to range from 7 to 9%. And the rates were changed every month. There were two different bills in 2016 and 2021 that changed these rates into what we call fixed rate. So now you always multiply by either 9% or 4%. You don't have to look up the rate. It doesn't change every month. There may be folks on this call who remember, just last year, 3.14, 3.16, all over the place, right? Now it's always just 4%. That is great for us because we always, we get a bit more tax credits, right? That is going to get us our annual tax credit. Okay, so in this example, we're pretending it's a 9% project. So we've got $6.5 million of that qualified basis. Remember, we calculated that in the last step. We're going to multiply that times 9%. And then we're going to get our annual tax credit of $585 grand. It looks like, I'm just taking a quick look at the chat here. Oh, yes, if we could upload the slides directly to the chat, that would be really great. I'm sorry that folks might still be struggling to get the slides. I'm hoping that, okay, great. Thank you, Will, for doing that. Appreciate it. Okay, so again, qualified basis times the tax credit rate. This could either be 9% or 4%, gets us our annual tax credit. This is what we're going to sell to the investor, right? So the TCAC says, hey, you have gotten an allocation of $585,000 a year in the next 10 years of taxes you don't have to pay. So we say, hey, great, thank you so much, TCAC. We're going to take this and we're going to find an investor who's going to pay for this. We're going to go to Bank of America. We're going to Wells Fargo, whoever it is, right? Enterprise is a syndicator. And we're going to say, hey, we've got these tax credits. Do you want them? And before we sort of sell them, we need to tell them how much we have all together. And that's going to be the total tax credits over 10 years, right? So we have this annual tax credit. It's, again, delivered every year the same amount over 10 years. And we get our total tax credits, right? So that should be hopefully relatively straightforward math. We get the annual credit, multiply it times 10 years. The total value of the tax credits is $5.85 million. Again, we're going to go now to the investor and we're going to say to many different investors, and we're going to say, who is interested in buying our tax credits? And they're going to say, I'm interested in buying your tax credits. For every $1 tax credits you sell me, I'm going to give you 95 cents. Another investor might say, hey, for every $1 tax credits you sell me, I'm gonna give you 98 cents. And another might say, I'm gonna give you 90 cents, right? So this is the tax credit factor. This is how much the investor is gonna pay you for every dollar of tax credits that you sell them. In this example, we're gonna pretend that it's 95 cents. The price is determined based on the market, based on the sort of characteristics of the development, based on the strength of the sponsor, the developer. These all impact the pricing that you're going to get for your state credits, right? So, you know, a few years ago, it was very common to get $1.20 for every dollar of tax credits. Now we're looking more like the low 90s, right? So all these different market fluctuations can impact the pricing of tax credits. So it's sort of a dynamic number. When we're finding out how much money the investor's actually going to give us, we take the total number of tax credits, we multiply how much they're going to pay us for every dollar of tax credits, and we get the investor equity. This is how much money you get to actually build the building. Okay. So again, we take the eligible basis. How much of costs do we have that we get to count towards the tax credit calculation? Next step, are we in a QCT or DDA? If so, we get this 130% boost. Next step, what percentage of our property is for affordable housing? In this case, we're presenting it 100%. It could be 50%. Next, what's the tax credit rate? Which program are we using? Are we using 9%? If so, we multiply that number by 9%. Are we going to use 4% tax credits? If so, we're going to multiply by 4%. That gets us our annual tax credit. Multiply that by 10, because the tax credits are delivered every year for 10 years. We get our total tax credits. Then we sell those tax credits to the investor pays us for them, we get the money. That's what we have to pay our costs in our development budget, okay? There are a couple of factors that influence the amount of tax credits. So what's an eligible basis, what's not an eligible basis? Do you have a lot of costs that are outside of eligible basis? Or are most of your costs inside eligible basis? That impacts how much tax credit you're going to get. Whether or not you're in a DDA or QCT impacts how much tax credit you're going to get, right? The percentage of units that are affordable, right? That's the applicable fraction we talked about, right? You only get tax credits on the units that are affordable. And the credit rate, right? Are you a 9% deal or are you a 4% deal? This last bullet point about energy and historic tax credits, you sort of don't get to double dip on costs. So if you are going to get, if you're going to build an affordable housing development and you're going to use the low income housing tax credit, if you also build solar on that development and want to use solar tax credits, you don't get to kind of double dip and get solar tax credits and affordable housing tax credits for the cost of the solar program, for example. So this is a sort of a more advanced topic. Don't worry if you don't really understand that, but just know that if you're doing historic credits or solar tax credits, that will sort of bring down, reduce the amount of low-income housing tax credits. Okay, poll question number 5. Can we start this one, please? Okay, so the first one I think is our hardest question of the day. So credits are delivered over blank years, and the initial compliance period, and both Lauren and I went over compliance period in earlier slides, is over blank years. So how many years do you deliver tax credits? And then how many years is the initial compliance period? How long that ownership is for? How long does the investor stay as part of the ownership of the property? Okay, next question. Oh, I guess that's also hard. Eligible basis and qualified basis are the same thing. Is that true or is that false? And we'll give you maybe another 10 or 15 seconds here to answer these two. All right, I think if we could close the poll question, please, and see the results. Whoa, oh my gosh, wow, you guys. I almost want to give you a standing ovation right now. Of all the poll questions we've asked so far, right, which many of them were easier than this one. You guys did the best on this one out of any of them so far. 96% of our attendees got this first one right, which I was almost too nervous to include in the presentation. Credits are normally delivered over 10 years, and the initial compliance period is 15 years. Great work, okay? That's a really important concept. I'm glad that you guys got that one. 96%, nice work. Okay, true, false. Eligible basis and qualified basis are the same thing. False. Eligible basis and qualified basis are not the same thing. And I'm just going to go back a couple of slides to quickly show you. Oops, sorry. Quickly show you again how eligible basis and qualified basis are different, right? So eligible basis up here at the top, right? That's the cost that you get to count towards the calculation. Qualified basis is different, right? Look, it's 6.5 million here versus 5 million. That's because qualified basis is after you do the calculation on high cost, right? Whether or not you're in a QCT or DDA, that special boost. And after you calculate the applicable fraction, what percent of the units are affordable. So these are two different things. So it's great that you guys got that. At this point, I think we're going to go ahead and take a break before Lauren dives into the types of tax credits. We'll take a 5-minute break. We'll be back at 11:10. Please, if you would like, chime in with the Q&A box and we'll hit some of your questions. Otherwise, we'll see you back in about 4 or 5 minutes at 11:10. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. We are going to dive into a topic that I think a lot of you are interested in. What is the difference between the 9% and the 4% tax credit program? So we're going to start with our PowerPoint again and discuss the types of credits. So let's move on to the next slide. So starting with the 9% competitive program. So first of all, why do we call the 9% competitive as opposed to the 4% non-competitive? So we are discussing, keep in mind, tax credits, not bonds in this seminar. So for the tax credit program here in the state of California, the 9% program is considered very competitive. That means that TCAC, and thinking again about the layer cake, they have dictated that there is threshold requirements that every project who applies must meet. And then for the 9% program, they have a number of scoring criteria that will evaluate your project against all the other projects that are competing and will provide you with a final tie-breaking score, which will determine whether or not your project is awarded tax credits. The competitiveness is partially due to the fact, as Claire went over in her calculation, that the 9% program does generate a very large number of credits, which equates to equity for your LIHTC investment partner. That is the limited partner in the partnership. So again, when you did that calculation with Claire, it was 9% times your eligible basis, which was then taken over a 10-year period. So that is 10 times 9% times the basis. That's why the program is very competitive. It typically will allow you to fund far more of your development costs than the 9%, than the 4% program. We have gone over that the state of California is allocated an amount of tax credits annually, and that is based on a per capita or per person formula that currently works out to be approximately $2.81 per person that is counted in the state of California. Those credits are distributed across the state, and in the 9% program, there are 2 rounds of funding in which those credits are allocated. For the regular 9% competitive program, each individual project can request up to $2.5 million in annual tax credits. And that is occurring again over the 10-year period. So it works out to be 2.5 million times 10. Now, in the disaster program, that is also considered a 9% program. Projects that are eligible due to their designation as being in a federally declared disaster county do have a larger per project cap. What was recently passed by the Tax Credit Allocation Committee was a $4 million per project cap on annual tax credits. Now, when we go to the limited amount of credits that are available on an annual basis, and keep in mind those are separated into 2 different funding rounds. In addition, there are what I like to think of as buckets. So the state has determined that first, they've segregated the state into 12 different regions. Each region is then allocated a specific amount of credits annually. In addition to that, the state has designated 4 what they call set-asides. These are specialized projects that must meet very stringent requirements. Those set-asides are nonprofit, rural, at-risk, and special needs projects. Finally, TCAC does evaluate the general application pool, and they have 4 different types of housing projects that they have targeted that they want to invest for affordable housing. Those types are large family, special needs, at risk, and senior. So there are essentially three different layers or three different buckets that the state has targeted in terms of building affordable housing. So again, there's regions, then there's the type of project, which is a housing type, and then the 4 set-asides. So going on to the 4% program, how is this different? So again, we call it a non-competitive program because from the state's perspective, TCAC, they have an unlimited volume cap on how many 4% credits that they can give out in any given year. However, at the federal level, so thinking again of that base layer on your layer cake, the IRS has essentially married the 4% tax credit program to the bond program, the tax exempt bond program. So in other words, you are not able to access the 4% program unless you receive an allocation of tax exempt bonds. Now, the tax exempt bond program has become what we call oversubscribed, which means that they receive more applications in every round than there are bonds available. CDLAC, the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee, is the agency that allocates these bonds. When you apply for 4% non-competitive tax credits, you concurrently submit an application to CDLAC, that's the Debt Limit Allocation Committee, for your bonds. They're submitted on the same day. It's the same package. And so CDLAC will be doing their own review of your project concurrently with TCAC. Now, as I said, the 4% program is non-competitive from TCAC's perspective, but the CDLAC bond program has very similar scoring criteria as the competitive 9% tax credit program. So again, this, while we call it non-competitive, keep in mind that you must have bonds in order to be able to get an award of these 4% credits. Now, we call it again non-competitive. It also generates lower credits for your project. So when Claire went over that calculation for the 4% program, you would swap out 9 for 4% to determine the number of annual credits that you receive. So moving on to the next slide, the different project types. So this is applicable to both the 9% and the 4% program. So your project may be considered new construction. And in that case, you're going to receive tax credits on all of your new construction eligible basis. So those are the costs that the IRS allows for you to be included in your basis, which would then get multiplied by either the 9% or the 4% rate. Now there's acquisition and rehabilitation projects. Okay, we're going to go back to that layer cake example here. So when you think about rehabilitation, there are 3 different things to consider to meet the minimum rehabilitation test. Currently, as of 2020, the IRS published per unit minimum amount of rehabilitation that's required is $7,100. Now, if you're applying to the tax credit program, TCAC for an existing building has a requirement of $40,000 per unit or 20% of the eligible rehab basis. Finally, if you are applying to the bond program, CDLAC, they publish a minimum rehabilitation of $15,000 per unit in rehab costs. So keep in mind what program you're applying to and be cognizant of what those minimum tests are if you are applying to the acquisition and rehabilitation tax credit program. On the acquisition and rehabilitation side, you are allowed to get tax credits on both the rehabilitation eligible basis as well as the building acquisition cost. In no circumstances is the cost of land allowed to generate tax credits. Okay, so let's go to the matrix. so that you can understand the distinction between the different types of credit rate. So again, 9% is considered taxable debt. 4% must be married with those tax exempt bonds. Okay, we're not seeing the interpreter anymore. So I just want to ask that Housing California can pin the new ASL interpreter. Okay, thank you. So for new construction, if you're going in as a 4% project, you are able to get the 4% rate on all of your new construction eligible basis. You are not allowed to get any credits on the acquisition portion of your basis. Now, if we move on to new construction under the 9% program, you are allowed to multiply your eligible basis times 9%. But again, you're still not eligible to get any credits on your acquisition portion of your basis. Now we get a little more complicated. Here's our next, the acquisition rehab 4% program. This is where, again, you must meet the minimum rehab test. I think in the chat, somebody had asked what those tests are. At the federal level, it's $7,100 per unit. CIDLAC, the bond allocation agency, is $15,000 per unit, and TCAC requires $40,000 or 20% of your eligible basis. So you receive 4% times your rehab eligible basis plus 4% on your acquisition eligible basis. Now, finally, this is our most complicated structure, is the 9% acquisition rehab. In this scenario, you receive 9% times your rehab eligible basis, but you only receive 4% on the acquisition eligible basis. So we're going to go into this a little more detail in the next slide. Again, I want you to think of these two programs as the 9% credit program and the 4% credit. So the 9% credit program is competitive. It's competitive because there is a very fixed per capita cap on the amount of credits that TCAC is able to distribute in any calendar year, which works out again to be about $2.81 per person. On the 9% program, your construction costs, those are typically costs such as your hard costs, your relocation, if you're doing temporary relocation, all of your engineering costs, your developer fee can be included in your eligible basis. And then what's excluded from eligible basis in that calculation of what you can receive credits on. So you cannot receive eligible basis for any reserves that are paid for as part of your development costs. Your permanent loan, if you do have a permanent long-term mortgage, any costs that are associated with financing that permanent long-term mortgage are not included in the credit calculation. The fees that you pay to TCAC are also not included in your credit calculation. And then a portion of your construction loan interest, any construction loan interest that you pay after you're done constructing your building, is not included in that eligible basis calculation. The 4% program is similar in that, again, the credits are non-competitive, but the bonds are competitive and follow a similar but slightly different methodology than the 9% credit scoring competition. And then for the 4% credit program, the construction related costs are also the same as what's allowed in the 9% program. So any hard costs, relocation, engineering, or soft costs can be included in the calculation of eligible basis. And then the costs that are not allowed in basis are your reserves, your perm loan costs, and then a portion of the construction loan interest. Okay, so next up, acquisition and rehab. So again, if you are going for the competitive 9% credit, you must meet that substantial rehab test in the competitive 4% program. So if you were going in to the 9% round and you were under the 4% competitive aspect of that round, you can get building acquisition costs in certain cases. Now, in the tax exempt bond program, that's considered non-competitive for the tax credit perspective, but the bonds themselves are a competitive program. So in the 4% non-competitive 4% program, the substantial rehab costs are allowed. And again, you must meet that test. And then in a non-competitive acquisition plus rehabilitation, some of your acquisition costs will be allowed in basis. That excludes land. Keep that in mind. So it's just the acquisition of your building. So again, the 9% program and the 4% program are similar in some cases, but their competitiveness is different. Great. So now we're going to move on to federal milestones. So we're going to go, this is a calendar that I want to have you keep in mind when you're planning to submit an application. So once you submit your application, there's a number of steps that you're going to have to take. So what we've done in this slide for you is we've designated, again, anything in black is the IRS federal guidelines. So any application throughout the country who applies for 9% competitive credits need to take these steps. Now, TCAC, our allocation agency, they are in green. So these are additional requirements that TCAC has placed in terms of your timeline and your life cycle of your project. Okay, so at application for the 9% program, we currently have 2 rounds per year. And it's generally those rounds, the applications are due in February and in July. It takes approximately 90 days for TCAC to review all the applications, score them, and then schedule their meeting. Now, the next step is that preliminary reservation. So TCAC publishes the list, and then they hold a very public meeting that anybody can participate in. And that's where they approve the projects who have met all of the criteria and have scored well enough. And keep in mind, also have utilized the available total credits that were allocated to the state. The next step, if you receive an award at that meeting, there is from the IRS mandate something that's called a carryover application, which is also known as the 10% test. This must be filed with TCAC by October 31st of the year in which you received your credit. Again, this is only applicable to the 9% program. And again, this is a federal requirement that you must meet this 10% of expenditure test. So when you look at the calendar, if you apply in February, and then approximately 90 days later, you receive an award from TCAC, there is a chance that you may be able to file your 10% test with TCAC by October 31st. You essentially outline the eligible costs that you have spent on your project, showing that you have met the 10% test. Now, if you have applied in the second round in July, and TCAC holds their meeting 90 days later, which is generally in the month of September, then it is very unlikely that you are going to be able to show TCAC that you have expended 10% of your costs. And so in that case, you file what's called the carryover application. This allows you an additional 12 months in which to show TCAC that you have spent 10% of your eligible costs. So it basically gives you a cushion. Now, I am going to warn you that that carryover application does come to a cost to your project. You must pay a reservation fee in order to receive the carryover grace period. That is a refundable fee. However, you again would have until October 31st of the following year to show that you have met that 10% test. So again, most projects that receive their awards in the second round generally are going to have to apply for the carryover application, which means you are going to have to pay a fee. So make sure to include that in your development budget. So the next deadline that comes up is a readiness closing deadline. So in this case, TCAC has required that you must be closed on your construction financing, and you must have been issued a building permit. And this is not a grading permit. This is an actual building permit that would allow you to start construction. When you are ready, you file this with TCAC, and you essentially send in a package of documentation, which includes an updated application. It also includes proof that you've received your building permit and that you've shown TCAC that you have closed on your financing and that you really are meeting your readiness closing deadline. Now, there is one exception. Some projects are eligible for an extension. Those projects, particularly in this time of COVID, have been able to request a grace period on the 6-month closing deadline. But keep in mind, if you're asking for any grace period, that must occur before the actual deadline passes. So the next deadline is placed in service. For most projects, this is inflexible. This is an IRS deadline. This is not a deadline that's mandated by the state. So your placed in service deadline, you must have completed construction and your occupancy must have begun by 12/31 of the second year following the preliminary reservation. So if you received your award in 2020, you must be complete and your buildings must be ready for occupancy by 12/31 of 2022. There is one exception that is allowed by the government, and this is for buildings. First of all, any building that was in the disaster declared areas in January of the year following the year in which they received their reservation, they may ask to exchange their credits. That essentially means if you received a reservation in 2020, in January of 2021, you can exchange your credits for 2021 credits, and your place in service deadline gets bumped out until 2023. So it gives you one more year. The other projects that are eligible for this are high rises. And then of course, if your project experience something that's known as an act of God, something that's beyond your control, you can petition to TCAC. This is completely at their discretion, however, to get an extension and exchange your credits to give you that additional year. Now, finally, again, this is a federal requirement. You must file a request for the tax form, which is known as the 8609. It's called 8609 because that is literally the name of the form. The form is the IRS form 8609. You are requesting that TCAC issue this tax form. What this does is it essentially fixes in place the exact dollar amount of tax credits that your project will receive that flow to your limited partner that allows them to take that tax incentive. So that is filed with TCAC 1 year after your building has been placed in service. So you have 12 months in which to file this documentation with TCAC. The package includes an updated application. It also includes certified costs. So your accountant will actually go through all of the costs that you have spent to construct or rehabilitate your project, and they will certify which ones are eligible to be in your eligible basis and which ones are not eligible. That calculation then determines the number of annual credits, and that dollar amount is then indicated on your 8609 form. And that document becomes essentially the tax Bible for your project. It essentially locks in how many credits your project will receive. Now we're going to go over the 4% timeline, which is far easier to understand. So you apply, and as it stands this year, there are 3 rounds. This year, the applications are due to TCAC in January, May, and September. And again, this is a concurrent application. So you're applying both to TCAC and CDLAC, the bond agency, simultaneously. The agency has 90 days to score your project, make sure that it meets the threshold requirements, and then they publish a list of eligible projects. Again, there's going to be a public meeting in which the preliminary reservation of credits are awarded. Again, CDLAC has a concurrent meeting that occurs usually either before or after the TCAC meeting, and they award projects bonds. And so essentially, if you have received a tax credit award in the 4% program and a bond award, then you're good to go and you can start working on closing your construction financing. Now, for the 4% program, the tax credits do not have a deadline on when you must close on your construction financing, but the bonds do. So the bonds say that you must close on your bond tax exempt construction financing within 6 months of that reservation meeting. So again, this is a bond requirement, not a tax credit requirement. Now in the 4% program, after you've closed in your construction financing, you speed along, you build your building, and your next due date is determined again by the federal government, where they require you to file a request for issuance of your 8609 tax form. It is nearly identical to the 9% program. You fill out a complete placed in service application, which includes certification from your accountant of all of the eligible costs. And that again determines how many credits your investor will be receiving on an annual basis during the 10-year period. There was a question in the chat, and I want to really stress that TCAC and CDLAC are 2 agencies that work hand in hand. And while your project is not scored competitively by TCAC under the 4% program, it is scored competitively under the bond program. So if you do not receive a bond award, TCAC is going to match those applications to the CDLAC awards, and they will award 4% credits to all of the credits that have received a bond allocation. Okay, great. So I think we are moving on now. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Anthony Zito has joined us, and he is from the Tax Credit Allocation Committee. Welcome, Anthony. We're so glad that you could join us.
Good morning. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to actually cover the TCAC requirements and underwriting, as well as obtaining an allocation. So we'll just, it looks like we got 20 minutes. So we'll try to move through this without rushing. Okay, how's that? Okay. All right, so for all applications, as Lauren and both Claire mentioned, you know, we have 9% and 4% applications, but one thing that is required of all applications are these threshold requirements, some of which are shown on the slide here. Housing need and demand, that's basically you have to submit a market study and show sufficient demand. One of the requirements is that the comparables that are presented in the market study are at least 10% below, or the subject property is rents are at least 10% below the market, okay? Another one is site control. Site control, we need documentation showing that the applicant holds site control. And that could be in the form of they already took over the land and they have a grant deed, or they're currently in a purchase and sales agreement with the seller. There's various ways to document that. Local approvals and zoning, projects have to have all their local approvals nailed down and then zoned for its intended use. Financial feasibility, we require a financing plan. We have to make sure that obviously all the sources, there's various requirements for 9s and 4s. There is some differences, but for the most part, we have to make sure that the project is feasible and that we're not giving the project more credits than they need. Development team experience. We have minimum requirements for a developer, and they have to document that by way of showing how many projects they have in their that they've had placed in service. And then minimum construction standards, that includes roofing, exterior doors, energy efficiency requirements. There's various minimum construction standards that we require. Accessibility is another one. And those are all outlined in our regulations. Next slide. All right, we're going to move to a poll question. Tax exempt bonds can be used with both 4% and 9%. So is that true? Or is it false that they can only be used with 4%? Or is it false they can only be used with 9%? And then the second question is, both 4% and 9% tax credit applications are competitive. Is that true? Or is it false where 4% credits are non-competitive, or false 9% are non-competitive? And we'll give you about 10 seconds to answer those questions. All right. Do we have the results? Okay, 72% of you guys got, okay, let's see. Tax exempt bonds can only be used with 4% projects. Okay, so 72% of you guys got that, good job. And then the 4% and 9% tax credit applications are competitive. False 4% are non-competitive. That is correct. 83% of you, well done. We're going to move on to the next slide.
Sorry, Anthony. It looks like Meg has her hand raised. I'm not sure, Meg.
Oh. Sorry.
If you had something, or if that was accidental, Meg.
Meg, do you have anything?
Oh, accidental. Okay, sorry. I'll move on to the next slide.
No worries. Okay, so TCAC's underwriting feasibility criteria. So as previously mentioned, there's different requirements for 9%, different requirements for 4%. And I think there was a question that floated up about developer fee. So this is a chart that kind of outlines the developer fee limits. So you can see that 9% and 4% do have different limits. And the 9% new construction is basically the lesser of 2.2 million or 15% of the basis, whichever is less. So, and then that same amount can be included in basis. Okay. For AC rehabs, it's slightly different. The cost is about the cost is the same, but in basis for acquisition rehab, you can include 15% of the construction related basis. So that's the rehab costs, and a 5% in acquisition costs. Okay. Now, 4% is slightly different. There is no dollar cap. The limit on the developer fee is specifically based on basis, and the number is 15% for new construction. And then 4% AC rehab. Let's see. Okay, so it's 15%. Actually, I think that 2.2 might be. Oh, you know what? I was confusing myself. Yeah, so it's 2.2 or 5% of the acquisition, similar to the 9%, 15% of construction related. However, you can get a bump to that 5% on the acquisition basis if you meet one of the 3 criteria that's noted in the chart. If you're at risk, so if you're at risk, you meet the housing type of at risk. If you're proposing at least $50,000 per unit of rehab and hard costs, or if you're targeting at least 30% of your units at or below 50% of area median income. In those cases, you can use up to 15% in acquisition basis. And while there's no dollar cap, we do have a 2.5 cap in that if you are proposing a number that exceeds 2.5, say 3 million, you would have to defer anything over that 2.5 where it would be contributed back to the project, or deferred developer fee, or contributed as equity, sorry. And I think the other thing is, so it says 2.5, but if you have a project that's over 100 units, then for every unit over 100, you get 20,000 per unit that gets added to that 2.5. So that basically increases the amount of cash out developer fee that the developer can take. Otherwise, any overage beyond that total will have to be deferred. Okay, next slide. Okay, so construction contract limits. We do have a 14% limit on general conditions, overhead, and profit. So anything that exceeds 14%, that is our cap. So you have to make sure you're meeting that. Capitalized operating reserve. We require that you capitalize an amount that's equal to 3 months. So that basically, the calculation is basically all of your annual operating expenses and your annual debt service payments. We take a quarter of that, which represents 3 months, and you have to capitalize it with the funding source in your development budget. Okay. All right, so for operating, we want to make sure that the project as presented is going to be successful. And so we use trending assumptions. So for income, the gross income in a project, we assume a 2.5 increase annually. For the expenses, so annual operating expenses, we assume a 3.5 increase annually. And then for property tax, we assume a 2%. As far as vacancy rates goes, so obviously projects aren't always 100% occupied. So for large family, senior, and at-risk projects, we assume a 5% vacancy rate. And these are all, so these rates, the application kind of calculates all this for you. And then for special needs projects, we allow a 5 to 10% vacancy rate for those projects that actually have rental subsidy. If you don't have rental subsidy, then we require a 10% vacancy rate. Okay. Okay, so on the slide here, we have the minimum operating expenses. And so basically projects, we have a minimum amount that you have to use for underwriting purposes. And this chart shows it based on region and based on housing type. And if you're proposing elevator and non-elevator. And these numbers were established based on submissions from owners. They're required to provide annual information on their existing projects. And so these are derived using our own data that's submitted to us. And basically a project that is applying, they have to show that they are meeting these minimum operating expenses, that they're building in these minimum operating expenses into their application. We often see these higher than the minimums, but these are the minimums we require. Okay, excellent. All right, so also in the operating budget, so as I mentioned, we had those trending assumptions. We also assume, or we have minimums for new construction projects, 250 per unit per year for new construction replacement reserves. And these are for, you're putting away money each year in the event that the project needs, maintenance to the project. And then, so that's for new construction, 250 per unit per year. And for all other types of projects, we require 300 per unit per year. And then the loan terms, so we require that your cash flow support a minimum of 1.15 to 1 ratio. So in other words, your cash flow, whatever after you're done paying for cash, prior to your debt service calculation, that dollar amount needs to equal at least 1.15 of the debt that you have to pay annually. And then the property tax, 1% of the value. Now, oftentimes we see projects joint venture with a nonprofit, and in those instances, they get a welfare exemption. So they typically have either 0 or a very minimal amount of tax, property tax that they build into their cash flow. Okay. All right, so now that was the minimum we talked about. Now we also have a maximum cash flow that we require, and we take a look at the first 3 years, and we look at the debt service, and we look at the gross income. So whichever is higher, so 25% of the annual debt service, or 8% of the gross income, whichever amount is higher, that's what your cash flow for that project has to meet in the first 3 years. And the next slide will show an example of that. There is one exception to this limit, and those are for cases where the cash flow trends down between years 1 and 15, because there's no, I'm trying to think what the reasons were. But anyways, there's instances where the financing and subsidies results in projects having their cash flow trend downwards. And in those instances, we allow the cash flow limit to exceed in the first 3 years. However, we need to, and the way we calculate this is we make sure that in year 15, that we used to call it a break even, but then there was comments on, okay, well, what constitutes break even? So this is when we established year 15 cash flow as break even is defined as the greater of 2% of gross income, or 25,000 or 500 per unit, whichever is lower. So whichever one of those 2 bullet points is higher, that's the number that we require, that will provide you that exception in the first 3 years. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this is an example of the cash flow. So years 1, 2, and 3. So as you can see, the highlighted items, debt DSC is the debt service coverage ratio. So in this particular project, as you can see, 1.15 to 1 has been met in all 3 years. Now the 8% income and 25% debt service test, remember 8% is the limit. So as you can see, in the first 3 years, it ranges from 3.73 to 4 to almost 5. And then in the 25% calculation, it ranges from 15 to 20. So as long as they're meeting one of those 2 tests, which in this case, they're meeting both tests, they are fine as far as the cap goes. But if it were a case where both of those were not being met, then the project would be exceeding our cash flow limits. All right, we're going to move on to obtaining an allocation. So we'll talk about that. So as mentioned previously, 4%, 9% credits are allocated in California by TCAC, and the website is available there. The tax exempt bonds allocated to California by CDLAC, the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee, and the website's there. And again, just by way of reminder, 4% credits must be accompanied with tax exempt bonds. So that's where it's very key that we work very closely with CDLAC and make sure, and again, I think Lauren had mentioned, we essentially deferred our recommendations when we have projects that we're recommending, they have to get a bond allocation from CDLAC in order to proceed with the tax credit reservation. Okay. All right, so I think this was mentioned previously, but I'll go over it. 4% credits, non-competitive again. You get 4% credits on both the acquisition and the construction related basis. And again, if you meet the minimum requirements and you ultimately receive a bond allocation, then you will be reserved 4% credits. 9% credits, on the other hand, are competitive due to the limited nature of those in the state for each year. So you get 9% on construction related basis. And then in the instance of a rehab and acquisition, you could get 4% on acquisition basis. And again, you have to compete. We have a very competitive system, typically 2 to 1 oversubscribed, and it's a very competitive system. I think most projects, in order to be successful, have to score the full points. Okay, next slide. 4% with state credits, and while it says competitive, it's really, just recently in December, we adopted regulation changes that while they were competitive and they used to come in through the 9% rounds, they are now coming in through the 4% rounds. And again, it's going to be dependent on their success in obtaining a bond allocation. But they still have the same 4% on acquisition and construction related basis. If they get state credits, they will get it based on the construction related basis, but they will only get it on an acquisition related basis. In other words, the way that the state credits is calculated, it will only apply to the acquisition basis if they are meet the at-risk definition. And again, just to reiterate, these applications are now submitted in the same rounds as the all of the other 4% funding rounds. All right, so moving on, threshold requirements. So here's some requirements of 9% projects. We require that all deferred payment financing and grants and subsidies be committed at the time of application. These are typically city or public loans that are residual receipt and soft loans and grants. They have to be committed at the time of application. We have project size limitations. Rural, we have 80 units as the limit on rural, and then rehab, we don't have a limit. And we do offer waivers to some of these limits, and those have to be submitted before the application deadline. Rehab requirements, we have a hard cost requirement of $40,000 per unit, or 20% of the adjusted basis of the building, whichever is higher. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, so housing types. So unlike the 4%, the 9% projects, you have to meet one of the housing types. And actually, Claire, I apologize, there's one housing type that wasn't represented on here, which was added back. It's called SRO. But SRO was years ago, it was existing in the system and it came out and it's back in. So I just want to reiterate that. But anyways, yeah, so you have to meet one of these housing types: large family, senior, at risk, or special needs. And we put some of the features for each of those housing types. And there's at least, 7, 8, 9, 10 requirements associated with each of these. But I'm just going to highlight a few of them. For large family, you have to have at least 25% of your units at 3-bedroom, and 25% at 25% at 2 or larger bedrooms. For seniors, we require that it be a senior project that meets California Civil Code, Section 51.3. At risk, there's the list of requirements that must be met. Again, these are projects that are at risk of losing their affordability. Special needs, at least 45% of the units have to be special needs. If you're proposing a project where less than 75% is special needs, you have to meet other requirements, and all of the units have to be an average income. They have to be targeted an average of 40% of area median income. And then SRO is very similar. Has some of the same requirements as special needs, but single room occupancy projects. And again, these are all outlined in the TCAC regulations. Okay, next slide. All right, so threshold requirements. So these are some of the point competitive items that we score. We have site amenities. You know what, actually, I'm thinking this is, okay, you know what, I'm sorry, I apologize. These are still the housing type related amenities. So we have laundry facility requirements. So for large family, at least if you have, for every 10 units, you have to have at least a washer and dryer. Play areas, outdoor play area requirements for large families. So like I said, each of the housing types has specific requirements. And resident services, special needs requirements has a little bit more rigorous resident service requirements. We do have minimum square footage requirements for both, for all of the housing types actually. And that could include unit size and as well as common areas. So those are some of the additional threshold requirements of those housing types. Okay, so this is an outline of the point system. As you can see, there's various categories that we score, and the point totals are all outlined there. Experience, we give points based on general partner and management experience. And housing needs. So housing needs is pretty much an automatic category because it's a threshold requirement. So by way of meeting the threshold requirement, you would essentially be getting the housing needs points at 10 points. Site amenities, you get 15 points. and these are proximity near schools, hospitals, libraries, transit, etc. Services, you can get up to 10 points for providing service coordinators, after school classes, and there's a laundry list of items there. Lowest income measures the affordability. So the deeper targeting that you're proposing, there's a chart that's in the application. You can get points in various ways. We have up to 52 points there. Readiness to proceed, if you are committing to begin construction within 180 days of award, and you also have all of your construction financing committed, you can get 10 points there. And then the miscellaneous federal and state policies is kind of a catch-all of other items that you can get points for from non-smoking buildings. If you're electing to accept state credits where you only requested for, federal credits, in the event that we have to do an exchange at the conclusion of a year, you're basically committing to that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so tiebreakers. In a couple of the regions, LA and San Francisco only, if you have a formal letter of support from those two agencies, the Mayor's Office of Housing or HCID LA, that will give you an initial tiebreaker over another project with all things equal as far as the point score goes. The first housing type is if we have two projects with the same score, if one of them's a senior, one of them's large family, and we've met the goal for one of them, then we're going to select the project where the goal has not been met yet. In the instance where they have the same housing type or either both goals have either been met or not met, we will go to the second tiebreaker, which is outlined in that calculation right there, which focuses on soft financing sources over total development costs. And then it also incentivizes lower requested credit amount by way of requested eligible basis. And so those are the focuses on that second tiebreaker. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the allocation system, as mentioned previously, we have specific set-asides that are funded, and those are listed right there, nonprofit, rural, at risk, and then housing type goals. And so when I had said that some of these goals aren't met, these are the percentages that we use to determine that. So in other words, if a project, if we had large family projects and we met the 65% goal and the senior 15% has not been met in that tiebreaker discussion, we would select the senior. But these are the goals that we aim for in our allocation system. Okay, and again, these are the set-asides that we fund from. Nonprofit, and nonprofit 10%, that's a federal requirement. Rural, we fund 20%. At risk, we have 5%. And some of these projects, if they're unsuccessful in the set-asides, with the exception of rural, they can drop into the geographic competition. Next. All right, and so the geographic regions are broken out there, and that's the conclusion.
I'm so sorry. I'm having technical difficulties.
That's okay. I was trying to go as fast as I could.
I really didn't mean to do that, Anthony.
That's okay.
We just had the one poll question left, and then we're almost done. I am so sorry for having technical difficulties.
No, that's okay. So the TCAC, the poll question number 7 is TCAC's underwriting requirements apply only to 9% projects. Is that true or false? And we'll give you about 5 seconds to answer that question. That's false. That's correct. Good job, everyone. Underwriting requirements are required of all projects. So that's a good job on that. And I think that was the last poll question, right? And
yes, that's it.
All right.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Now,
thank you.
For all of those who got it, let's say 80% of the questions correct, call out in the chat or whatever, and we will clap. We'll do a big clap round of applause for you. So thank you. Woo! Thank you so much for attending the presentation. Anthony, thank you. I'm so sorry you got cut short. This is, as everyone can tell, this is a really juicy topic. Lots to discover here. Please take home those slides, save them, print them, study them. And of course, you can turn to your friendly California Housing Partnership financial consultant or to TCAC for more details on anything we've talked about today. There were a lot of questions in the Q&A about that related to the bonds. So please join us at 1 p.m. For a presentation on the tax-exempt bond fundamentals. And one last time, I know I sound like a broken record. I'm going to keep posting that survey that is so valuable for us making this presentation better in the future. So please take that survey. We really do appreciate it. And thank you so much to the Housing California team, and also to our ASL interpreters who have been working so hard to get you this information. I think we're all done. I'm not sure, Housing California team, if you have any outros that you need to share. I think we're good. Well, thank you all. Thanks to our presenters. Thanks to the Housing California team, the interpreters, Anthony and Lauren. And we'll see you guys at 1 p.m. Thank you.